Hello again, ladies and gents, it's Hagbard Celine here with another video, another request from one of my more active subscribers. This is from a channel called PhilosophyTube, something I have near and dear to my heart as I was actually a philosophy student. Well, it appears to be a good thing that I was removed from that environment before it rapidly deteriorated. This video is also about race. Wait. Before you click close, it's not about American race relations per se, at least not primarily. So far as I can gather, it's about racialization as a political technology. Now, before anybody says, "Oh, what do you know about this subject? These are college-level masters, yada yada yada," I have two things to say. First, I got this request for the first time almost a week ago, and in that time I purchased an e-copy of the main inspiration for this video's book, Toward a Political Philosophy of Race, which set me back about $30 dues, although I consider it a deal as she wants about $600 for a new hardcover version of that book. Two, one name, two words. Ben Carson. Dr. Ben Carson. So with that in mind, and ignoring the appeal to authority fallacy, let us begin. Alright, just relax everyone. I know that this is getting to be a bit of a trigger word. Just breathe deeply now.
This video is part 1 of 2. In this episode we'll be looking at the work of Falguni Sheth and learning about race, racialization and political philosophy.
As I said, I have done my homework and I am prepared.
In part 2 we'll look at a case study and discuss the racialization of Muslims in so-called Western liberal societies.
I may or may not do part 2, frankly depending on the response I get to this video.
We've got a lot of ground to cover today, so I'm going to jump right in. There's this big debate over whether race is a series of biological categories or whether it's just a social construct.
And our beloved author has inserted a third concept, much beloved by Marxists. An idea that it's an imperialist technology of control. Proceed, my twee little friend.
And in her book, Toward a Political Philosophy of Race, Falguni Sheth tries to break away from that binary. She says that to talk about race just as a biological category ignores all the ways that it's used in politics and law.
I am sure that you have many everyday examples of that for us too.
And to talk about it just as a social construct ignores the more interesting questions of who constructs it, why do they construct it, and how do they do it?
Ah, so we're to the blame-placing stage, are we? Good, go on.
Sheth thinks that the concept of race is a type of technology. It's a mental tool used by those in power, that's the who. They use it to manage unruly populations, that's the why, and they do this through racialization, that's the how.
Sure, that adds up. Tidy as can be, no questions needed, and it certainly explains the behavior of the rulers of Saudi Arabia, China, Russia, large swaths of Africa and South America that are hotbeds for politicized racial debates.
So let's go through it and I'll explain to you what all of that means.
I simply cannot wait to be condescended to further.
The technology of race is used by sovereign power. That's a term that Sheth borrows from Foucault, and for the purposes of this video we can take it to mean whoever is officially in charge and the systems through which their power is expressed.
So the mixed ethnicity ruling class and the mixed ethnicity police forces are in charge of racialization. Okay.
Sheth talks specifically about liberal societies. By liberal societies, she means societies with certain basic assumptions at their heart. For instance, a division between the public and the private spheres, an insistence that all citizens are equal, emphasis on the rule of law, where the law is thought to be fair and consented to democratically by the people. Liberalism also usually means capitalism, and since the tail end of the 20th century, it's increasingly meant neoliberal capitalism.
I'm going to make the leap now, with both feet, that the moral of the story is fuck all of those things. Go on.
With an emphasis on low welfare, low taxes, and free markets. Sheth has a very interesting view of what sovereign power and its legal and political systems are for. She thinks that the purpose of the state is to conserve its own power.
Here we are experiencing an odd bit of horseshoe theory, as the more liberal, I suppose, is now bordering on the far right's idea of government overreach. Interesting, my proper lad. Go on, I'm intrigued.
And by extension, conserve those basic liberal assumptions. The function of government is not to ensure peace or justice or fairness or anything like that. This is the self-preservation society.
Please no sing.
She thinks there's a paradox at the heart of liberalism. Liberal societies will talk the talk of inclusiveness and universal human rights for everyone, even as they systemically exclude from that embrace certain groups of people. Think about how the founding fathers of the US preached liberty and justice for all whilst owning slaves.
I'm becoming quite bored with this argument. Please do a bit more research on exactly how the terms within that document were defined in their time of use, sir.
It's not always as stark as that, but Sheth says that the promise of liberalism is very rarely realized for everyone.
Mind you, we're discussing, in the terms fully realized, an equality of outcome viewpoint on a globalist scale.
But sovereign power has to preserve the basic liberal assumptions. So what does it do? It creates exceptions. It rules out certain groups of people as not being eligible for entrance into the promised land, as not being eligible for protection, benefits, voting rights, whatever.
As in illegal immigrants, or as the author that inspired this little speech calls them, legally othered populations. You see, already we're discussing borderlessness of theory, something pragmatic thought should have crushed, had this lad any need for pragmatism.
As a bonus, if a population is enslaved, or there's an unjust war, or a refugee crisis, or a financial crash, then those disasters can be written off as mistakes.
But we all know there are no mistakes. There are only conspiracies from an omniscient government entity.
As misapplications of the principles of liberalism, because sovereign power can always say, oh, the exceptions that we made at the time looked legitimate, but in hindsight, they were actually errors.
Now that you've established that it is impossible for there to be poor intelligence on a given situation, please go on.
Anything but systemic problems. Okay, so we've said that the technology of race is used by sovereign power trying to preserve itself. We've covered the who, but preserve itself against what, exactly? Time to look at the why.
I have a feeling that this is about to get mighty anglicized.
Fortunately, this bit's pretty easy. Sovereign power wants to preserve itself against what Sheth calls the unruly. The unruly is that which is unpredictable, undependable, or threatening to a political order.
You do realize that those are all bad traits, right?
Sovereign power does not make exceptions of people randomly. If your existence or the way you live threatens any of the basic liberal assumptions, or even as is often the case, if it's just perceived as a threat to them, then you're in danger of being marked as unruly.
Look at that list. Read it a couple of times as I explain in simple terms that if you are a threat to the principles listed to the right, you are being rightfully classified as unruly. The only exception is in the practice and principles of the final one, as they are up for debate and tweaking as dictated by the necessities and sways of economic tides.
So for instance, if you openly display your private values in public, if you remind people that the law isn't always administered equally, if you actually need the welfare state in order to survive, then in the eyes of sovereign power, you can be a threat.
Stop trying to be emotive. Nobody considers the handicapped a threat, you fucking lunatic.
whether they're consciously aware of that and whether you actually are or not. So sovereign power wants to preserve itself against perceived challenges from the unruly by making exceptions of people. It's time now to bring race back into this.
Let's be serious, you never let race leave this, mate. Just used it for imagery instead of as words.
Tie all the threads together and explain how making those exceptions works. Racialization is the process by which a population is divided and one group is pushed further and further away from that promise of liberalism, both in the law and in the minds of the people. It is, quote, the process of delineating a population in contrast to a dominant population and a corresponding political tension.
I'm sure that you have some wonderful and non-allegorical examples for us.
It is how sovereign power creates exceptions to its own rules and makes those exceptions seem totally legitimate and natural. Racialization protects sovereign power and suppresses the unruly because there's an implied threat of violence for those who can't get into the promised land. If you're in the group that's racialized and pushed out and you don't get the protection or the benefits or whatever it is, well then that'd be bad for you, wouldn't it? So you better stop being unruly and toe the line.
That's funny, because those are the exact words that the extremely white warden used during my disciplinary hearing for being unruly. The point being, I was in the disciplinary hearing because I was being unruly.
Let's say that you and I represent sovereign power, and there's this group of people that we think are unruly, and we want to racialize them.
The problem with this whole theory is the presupposition that the population being unruly is easily racialized, i.e., of a race other than the majority.
In order to do that, we first need two things. They need to have some distinguishing feature that we can use to point them out to the dominant population and say, look, there's the enemy.
All white people are Neanderthal cave-dwelling savages that inhumanely and singly brought about all bad things in the universe. Does that count, lad?
It could be a physical thing, like their skin colour, but it might not. It could be their religion, or their socioeconomic status, or their sexuality. If they don't have a distinguishing feature, then we could always try giving them one, like for instance, making them wear a yellow star, or a red wristband.
I'm truly unsure of what he's referencing with the red wristband, but where I'm from, that denotes one of two things. Either your level of custody in incarceration, or if you have HIV. Things people might need to know.
They also need to be vulnerable already compared to the dominant population, otherwise it's going to be very difficult for us to racialize and push them out. Maybe there's some historical inequality that hasn't been rectified.
He means slavery. He isn't talking about the Welsh, the Irish, or the Scottish.
Maybe they're not represented in positions of power. Maybe they're new immigrants to our nation and they need our help to survive. We take their perceived unruliness.
Another thing, note that now he has gone from unruliness to perceived unruliness. See, no way is there a possibility that these people are actually being unruly now.
And we say, everybody with that distinguishing feature is like that. And that's how we write them all off as bad.
No, sir, that's called racism or bigotry. It's fairly obvious on the face of it.
And begin to justify excluding them from society as a race that we have effectively just created. Now, this bit is the hardest bit to understand. The distinguishing features then become the criteria by which sovereign power tells us it's making the distinction.
Here's another problem with the extreme left and the paranoid right, the presupposition of amazing power of the state to control and manipulate populations.
It's actually distinguishing on the basis of unruliness, but it's disguising that as a neutral, objective, possibly biological category.
The doublethink is strong with this one. You have it exactly opposite, and then you give it a crazy twist with the possibly biological finish there at the end.
Think about the lengths that the Nazis went to.
Oh, just a little Godwin's law for everyone there?
To prove that Aryans were a different race from Jews or Poles or whoever they wanted rid of at the time. It's politics disguising itself as neutral, objective science. Sheth thinks that physiological markers like skin colour and genetics don't constitute race. Rather, those features are used to point out populations that are already being racialized and pushed out because sovereign power perceives them as unruly.
Does this theory contain and explain, then, the differing racial and ethnic hierarchies in existence within the African continent, the Caribbean islands, and as recorded by the explorers of the now border states among the natives?
That's why some biological differences, like skin colour, are thought to constitute race, and some biological differences, like hair and eye colour, are just natural variation within a race.
These traits have nothing to do with the naturally occurring genetic diversity of your genetic area of origin. Not at all.
Because the rules for deploying the concept of race don't come from biology.
You should try telling that to all the quote-unquote racist babies.
They come from power. All this theory might seem a bit abstract, so let's look at a concrete example. Consider the internment of Japanese Americans in the USA just prior to World War II.
Something from this generation, please. Perhaps something that wasn't occurrent in a time of great confusion and war.
Many so-called Japanese Americans were actually American citizens, second or third generation descendants of Japanese immigrants. They could be distinguished on sight from the dominant white population. Their ancestors had faced obstacles like the alien land law and laws against mixed marriages, so compared to the white population they were already vulnerable. When the war started, the US government worried that they might rise up and commit mass sabotage. That was the perceived unruliness.
Again, you expect level heads to prevail in times of unrest and war, and then you draw modern moral conclusions from past moral behavior. You're like god kings inside your ivory enclaves, passing judgment on the past.
And so, on President Roosevelt's orders, 120,000 people had their ordinary rights suspended and were imprisoned in concentration camps.
Oh, don't overstate it or anything, please. Tell us about the gas showers and the ovens and the mass shootings for talking back to the guards in the internment camps. Please, please, oh posh one, tell us. I don't support the internment of the Japanese. However, I'm willing to approach it with a little bit more of a level head than that.
The state took a bunch of people who were in their eyes potentially unruly, drew a line around them, said everybody within that line is the same in terms of their threat to us, regardless of how much individual evidence we may have for their cases, and used that line as an excuse to literally lock them up.
Of course, this is all the US prison system is for black people, and the French and German prisons are for Muslims.
So to sum up, the concept of race functions as technology in a threefold way. Firstly, it classifies people according to their perceived unruliness.
Remember, jihad is not unrest.
Secondly, it disguises that classification under criteria that are politically neutral, like skin colour. And finally, it hides the true relationship of violence between citizens and sovereign power.
He has given us a more complex version of the power plus prejudice equals racism expanded to, ironically, roundly accuse the state of instigating all the woe in the world.
Sheth's model of race is neither biological category nor social construct. Rather, race latches onto certain observable variations in humans, sometimes biological, sometimes not, and attaches socio-political importance to them in order to preserve power. And this might actually explain a lot. Discriminating against somebody because their skin is a different colour, it's difficult to understand why anyone would do that. But discriminating against somebody because you've been told people like them are a threat, suddenly that's a lot easier to understand. And it might explain a few things too, like how young black men in the US are much more likely to be thought threatening and therefore shot by the police than young white men.
I'm just going to outright call bullshit, as I have seen countless reports showing the hesitancy of the police to shoot minority populations out of the fear of being called racist. Also, the group you're citing blames European prisons for the terrorist attacks being on the rise in Europe, so good luck with that.
Race is more than just a biological category, it's a socio-political one.
Only because you are all insisting on constructing it as one.
It's worth noting that once racialization becomes part of the law and the common discourse, we can perpetuate it without even meaning to or realizing.
I believe that you perpetuate harmful bullshit all the time without realizing it, as you are clearly a useful idiot.
Sheth's work has the power to transform not only our understanding of race, but our understanding of racism. You might have heard people say, I'm not racist because I don't hate anyone because of the colour of their skin. Well, now we know there's more to race than that. We are better equipped to identify racist thinking in others and in ourselves.
Everything is racist, everything is problematic, and we have to point it out.
I've had the misfortune of meeting a few racists in my time, and they won't tell you that they hate people because of the colour of their skin. They'll tell you that people like that are aggressive, or lazy, or rude, or whatever it is.
And only a moron would be fooled by that rhetoric, though I do appreciate your detail to realism that you gave that straw man. Be gentle now, my good viewers, as here comes the kicker.
You may have also heard people say you can't be racist towards white people, and at first glance that can look very odd.
Especially to those who have experienced racially motivated violence.
But if Sheth is right that race comes from power, given that white people have historically held the balance of power, we can see that racism is a more specialised and technical subset of discrimination.
Oh, so discrimination okay, racism bad, 'cause white.
Obviously, if anyone were to just quote the dictionary definition of racism, or the common definition of racism,
Note the disparaging, contemptuous manner with which he says the word common.
to try and refute that, they would be begging the question against all of Sheth's work. You would need to actually engage with her arguments.
Which is what I have done here. Please stop trying to play the logical fallacy game. You're full of them yourself.
Which leads me, finally, to this.
Fucking can't wait.
There are some final concerns to address before we finish part 1. Firstly, does this erase racial identity? Some people very proudly self-identify as members of a certain race, but if race is a tool of division and oppression created by the powerful, then aren't we taking that identity away from them? Sheth considers that and says no. Racial self-identity follows after a population has already been racialized.
We are now entering into La La Land, the realm of delusion, where observable reality is suspended and superseded by ideological drivel.
The racialized population learns from sovereign power to identify themselves as different from them. They are to be distinguished, and we can have both.
Just not white people, preferably.
Secondly, we've talked a lot about the failings of liberalism in this episode. Does that mean that liberalism as a project is doomed?
Watch here as he says no and then explains yes.
That fairness and equality and justice can't be had? Well, not necessarily. But what we need to realise is that the ideal of a liberal society is one that we often fall short of. Fairness, democracy, equality, these might be worth striving for, but we need to recognise not only where we fail to get them, but also where we set ourselves up to fail.
Systemically, what do you think that he's talking about here? I'm serious, please comment below. Comment on what systemically he's talking about.
Some people, I'm sure, are going to say that Sheth is redefining the word race, and you can't just redefine words. Well, hold your horses there, because she's not just plucking a new definition out of thin air, so much as she is arguing that the old definition in the dictionaries and the common discourse actually leaves a lot of very important things out.
Of course it does. It's like Martin Luther King. It's problematic because it just isn't intersectional enough.
And if we wanted to critique Sheth's ideas, if you're writing an essay or a comment, then the thing to do would be to ask, does her model of race Explain how we see the concept actually being used in the world, not just how the dictionary says we should see it being used.
No, we see it being used either in the exact reverse of what you've described here, or roundly ignored, as it ought to be.
Does it make any predictions about what we might observe? Does it explain any of the things we observe?
Please stop pretending like this is a science, you twit.
I've suggested already some ways in which it might. Is it useful? Remember, though, that it also makes some predictions about whose evidence we are more likely to think is authoritative in a society governed by sovereign power.
What an odd and novel use of ad hom, sir. Reverse appeal to authority? Appeal to an alternate authority? You're an odd duck.
So what do you think of Sheth's work on race and power?
Frankly, not much. Well, that is everything of substance. From here, it's the typical self-promotion and pats on the back all around. Let me make this clear. This is not a nobody. He has 50,000 plus subs on YouTube. He's a graduate of St. Andrews in Scotland with a Master's of Philosophy. He is a learned man, and this is what he has learned. He has videos like In Defense of the Word Problematic and Ditchins, or My Dawkins and Hitchens Atheist Phase. The former is an outright defense of intersectionality and the mental retardation inherent therein, and the latter being a diatribe on how much smarter and more moral he is compared to Hitchens and Dawkins. I say again, dependent on the response I get to this, I may do part 2, or I may do one of the 2 I just listed here on Saturday. I'd like to thank you all for watching with me, and I hope you enjoyed. I'll see you later, and good luck out there.